What is going on, you guys? This is Brandon from Comics Kings. Welcome, everybody, back to the kingdom. Happy Saturday. Hope everyone had a great week, got all your books. This is a heavy release week, but I'm super excited to be joined today by comic book legend JM DeMatteis. Wrote my favorite Spider-Man story of all time, Kraven's Last Hunt. Wrote some of my favorite stories in Justice League International. And here today, we're going to be talking about Ben Reilly Spiderman, out in January. JM, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure to be here, and I do accept the pronunciation DeMatteis. The preferred pronunciation is DeMatteis.
That's what I said, and Jim Shooter corrected me.
Well, because Jim knew it. DeMatteis is the authentic Italian pronunciation, and it got Americanized into DeMatteis, so a lot of people know me as DeMatteis. At a certain point, we decided, you know what, this is the right way to say it, and I switched from DeMatteis over to DeMatteis because it's the right way to say it, and it sounds a lot nicer. But I accept both, so it's okay.
I'll be getting an email later today. But anyway, man, thank you so much for being here. Quick question just to get started. What actually got you reading comic books?
You know, people ask me this question, and the answer, and I've tried to figure it out because I don't remember a time when I wasn't reading them. They were always sort of around. But I think the answer is what got me reading comic books was before comic books was newspaper comic strips. You know, when I was a kid, we would get the Sunday Daily News, and they'd have a big comic section, page after page after page of big full-color comics. And I think that's when that little chemical in my brain dropped, and I fell in love with that combination of words and pictures. So any place I could get that, I went for it. And I have memories of being a kid when I would go with my father. He'd go every night to buy the evening paper, and he'd buy me a comic book. Every night he'd buy me another comic book if I wanted one, you know. So they were just always around, and they were, you know, you didn't have to go to a comic shop in those days. They were everywhere, right. And so it was there. It was real easy access, and basically most kids read comics, you know. And I just fell in love with them, and it's a love affair that hasn't stopped for my whole life.
That's awesome, man. I think my first was actually in a comic shop. My grandmother knew I was a big Star Wars fan, so she took me to get a Star Wars comic book. So I ended up getting it signed years later, which is great. But that was really my first experience. Did any comic in particular really get you started or really stand out to you?
That's interesting. You know, when I was a kid, I would read anything. You know what I mean? If it was words and I mean, I loved. This is really, you know, Marvel was probably just getting started in this era that I'm thinking of. So I was reading all the DC stuff and Superman and Batman, but I really loved Green Lantern and Justice League.
Yes.
But I read anything, really. If it was words and pictures, I'd pick it up. And then right around the time when I was in junior high school, I have what I only half jokingly refer to as a religious conversion from DC to Marvel. That was when Marvel was really exploding, and I just fell in love with all that stuff. And then, of course, after a couple of years, when Kirby went back to DC, I said, if it's okay with Kirby, it's okay with me. So I went back and started reading DC stuff, but also at that same time discovered underground comics, you know, Crumb and all those guys. And again, it was words and pictures, and it can be in so many forms, so many genres. There's so much you can do with that. And the nice thing was, as I got older, comics kind of grew up with me. So in the 70s, suddenly, you know, you're reading, you know, Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson on Swamp Thing, Steve Gerber's amazing work, Steve Englehart's amazing work. Yeah. All this, the content really just deepened. We were talking before we started about Roy Thomas, who was such a link between the Stan Jack Ditko days and like the Gerber Englehart, you know, Wein Wolfman days.
Right.
A guy who really came along and deepened and expanded what those guys had built. So the comics kept growing up with me. So I actually, you know, some people go through a phase where they stop reading them and then they rediscover them. I never stopped. I've been reading them. You know, I probably, you know, now these days I don't read. I really don't read a lot. If a friend sends me his work or her work, and you know, I'm always happy to read anything with that mix of words and pictures. But I don't really haunt the comic shops anymore looking at what's out there. If I have a project and they send me a bunch of stuff because I need to have the backstory, you know, I'll always read it. One thing I did read recently, which was great, Tom Scioli, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, the guy who did Godland with Joe Casey. I don't know if you've ever read Godland. Great book. Anyway, he did a graphic novel biography of Jack Kirby, and I loved it. I really loved it. That's the most recent sort of comic booky thing I've read.
I'll definitely have to hunt that because I've not really heard of that. I'm reading probably just about anything right now. I think I'm in the same place where you were years ago, where I'm just reading everything with words and pictures.
Yeah, when I started out in the business, and I was working for DC and I started working for Marvel. So I used to get everything for free from DC and everything for free from Marvel. And in the beginning, when I started in the business, I read everything. I don't, books I would have never picked up off the stands myself. It would come in the bundle. I read everything because how could you not?
Right? It's there. It's Marvel, it's DC, if it's
Yeah.
okay with Kirby, it's okay with me,
Right, exactly.
Um, so what made you decide that you wanted to end up doing that as a profession? Because it's one thing we just read all these books, but actually
Yeah.
like put in your imagination involving with all the history of many of these characters.
Yeah, I was just always a creative kid. I spent a good part of my childhood on the living room floor drawing. Drawing was my first love, actually. And but I would write as well, and I still have memories of being with my best friend. We must have been 8 or 9 years old, writing and drawing our own comics, and any sort of creative outlet. And then I got into music. I started, learning guitar and playing in bands, but I still had. So it was always something creative. So I knew that I wanted to do something creative. And at a certain point, I was actually supposed to go to art school. I was going to go to the School of Visual Arts. And for financial reasons, that never happened. And my love of writing sort of took over from the artwork around that same time. And while I was still playing in bands, I was doing rock and roll journalism and writing, record reviews and concert reviews and all that. And just started really from the time I was 18. Every couple of years, I'd make another little attempt to send some stuff into Marvel or DC. And as I always tell my writing students, you bang your head against the wall long enough, if you are persistent enough, if you're open enough, if you can deal with rejection, you'll break that wall eventually. I always say, follow your passion. It may not lead you where you expect to go, and it will probably take you down some interesting, unexpected paths, but it will always take you someplace good. But you really need to have that passion and a really fierce will. You cannot be deterred. And right. I had that. I had more will than I had talent, to be honest, in the beginning. The talent was very raw and unformed, but I just wanted it. So, I always tell the story of when I first submitted some stuff to Paul Levitz at DC for the DC anthology comics. And I got a letter back tearing my stories apart, criticizing my typing. And at the end, though, it said, please feel free to submit again.
And that's all you needed, right?
That's all. Someone else would have read that and said, oh, he hated my stories. You think my typing is bad. And they would run away. And I was like, submit again. Okay. So, and that's how I always say you need a thick skin and a hard head if you're going to make it in the arts, in any art, whether it's music, writing, acting, dance, whatever, because there's a lot of rejection. Rejection is part and parcel through your entire career. No matter how successful you are, there's always rejection along the way. There just is.
Right.
And you have to be able to handle that.
Oh, 100%. That's definitely been my experience so far in this whole YouTube game that we've been embarking on probably for 6 months now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But, even like if I were to reach out to creators, be like, okay, I know you're going to say no to me now, but let's give it a few years. Or like some people like not collabing or like maybe not even watching a show. That's okay. There are many others. Or just like there are many other stories that could get through to that submission. Right. So let's talk about Spider-Man, right? Obviously, that's why we're here today. Ben Reilly he's been around for a little bit now in the Beyond Corporation. And he's for everyone who doesn't know, he is the clone to Peter Parker. And there's been a whole history. Jam, what is your take on all of this?
On the character, on his history, or
on
both?
His history? Let's start with the history.
I was very involved in the Clone Saga days. I was writing Amazing Spider-Man back then. The idea originally came up from one of our writers, Terry Cavanaugh, who basically said, what if we brought the clone back? And it turns out he's the real Spider. He's been the real Spider-Man all along. When I first heard, why don't we bring the clone back? My first reaction was, oh God, please, Spider-Man clone. I thought it was just the dumbest idea. And we were having a writer's meeting. And when Terry clarified this idea that, no, we're going to find out that he's actually the real one. And the Peter we've been reading about is the clone. I love that idea because I love stories about identity, who we are versus who we think we are. I don't know if you've ever read any Philip K. Dick, one of the greatest science fiction writers ever. He's always playing with that. Is this real? Is this not real? Are you who you think you are? or are you a replicant? Are you, reality is always being questioned. And I think if we want to get a little pseudo profound for a minute, our whole lives are about that, or about our search for who we truly are versus who other people think we are versus who even we think we are. Who are we really? So I thought this would be a great opportunity to explore those issues through Spider-Man. And we all got very excited. And it was a great idea. And the original plan was basically to do this story maybe at most 6 months to a year. Bring Ben back. We he didn't have a name. He was only in like 1 page or 2 pages of a Spider-Man comic in the 70s.
It was like Jerry Conway like introduced him, and
right.
It was like you didn't see him again.
Then he was gone. So I forget which one of us came up with Ben Reilly. Ben for Uncle Ben. Reilly was Aunt May's maiden name, and we started to develop Ben, and he's just a fascinating character. And we had this concept that he was on the road for we decided it was 5 years in real world time versus the 20 years Marvel time.
Right.
And so he's Peter, but he's not Peter. He at his core is the same decent, truly good human being who will always struggle to do what's right, even if he fails 100 times. But Ben basically had his very identity stripped away from him. And then he's off on the road for 5 years, essentially a nobody, going from place to place, not just around the country, but around the world, trying to build a life that he can never find. So he's a little darker, he's a little more twisted, he's a little more bitter. So a lot of that makes it a lot more interesting to me. I did a mini series called The Lost Years with John Romita Jr., which is one of my favorite Spider-Man projects that I ever worked on, which dealt with that period when he was on the road, and he and Kane, who was the other really, really warped clone of Peter. And it was one of my favorite stories, but it really, really kind of gave me a chance to deepen and expand Ben's character. So I fell in love with that character right away. I always loved writing Ben. And over the years, it's come up a few times where I've gotten calls from Marvel to do a little Ben Reilly short story here or a backup story there, but really nothing to really dive in and really, really explore in a deep way. So when my editor got in touch with me a few months back and sent me an email, and all I had to see was Ben Reilly in the email, and I was like, yes, I'll do it, absolutely.
All right, Morgan.
So I was stuck. It's like, when you write these characters for a long time, you get to know them. They stop becoming characters and they become people that they almost become like your friends. You know them. Right. I probably know Ben more deeply than I know some of my friends because I've lived inside his head. I know all his deepest, darkest, most
going on 30 some years, right?
Yeah. I don't know the deepest, darkest hidden secrets in all my friends' heads, but I know all the secrets in Ben's head,
Yeah.
So I know him so well. So when you get reunited with these characters, it's like seeing an old friend. You want to throw your arms around him and give him a hug, So working on this new series has just been a delight, really, just a total delight. Everybody on the team, our editor, Danny Kazim, David Baldion, who's doing the art, is just phenomenal. Every issue is better than the one before. He's just astonishing me. And Israel Silver, who's doing the colors. I mean, it's just a great team, and we're having a great time.
Right. Let's actually show off some of this artwork. These are like some of the pages that Marvel previewed. That's one of the pinups right there. And
it's actually it's a splash page. It's the first time in the first issue that we see Ben as Spider-Man.
That's awesome. I love like what you're doing with the lighting and the full moon. I love that pose right there. That outline's nice. This is obviously another one of the pages going over Ben's history.
Right.
Because you can kind of see the Scarlet Spider costume down in the left corner.
Right, and a lot of scenes from the Lost Years there, and that's Janine, who was his girlfriend during those years. Yeah.
Right. Janine's an interesting character. We're going to talk about her a little bit more in a little bit. And we have Ben. Looks a little frustrated, and
that's Dr. Kafka, a character that I created with Sal Buscema when we were doing Spectacular Spider-Man, bringing her back.
Right on. That's awesome. And then we got this last page. This one has to be probably my favorite, just because I love David Baldion's action scenes in here.
Yes.
I think it's so well done, and you can just see the anger in his face just going through the webbing of the mask. I love it.
The great thing about David's work is that he can do this. He can do the big action beats. But all the emotional stuff that I ask him for, all the subtleties of emotion, he delivers that too. You know, some guys can do the big action, but they can't do the quiet moments. Some guys are great at the quiet moments, but they may falter with the big action. And David can do them both really, really well.
Right.
And you
Right.
see how the beautiful color work really brings it all alive.
Oh yeah, it flows really well. And David really, because I was first introduced to him during the Domino series that Gail Simone did a few years back, and then like later again in X Factor, because X-Men is like my favorite. And I'll read everything X-Men, so I was really excited to see him there. And now here on Spider-Man, so I've been getting a lot of David's artwork, and it's great to see him grow over the years.
Oh yeah, even with, like I said, even within the course of the series, the first issue was great. He's turning in work on the third issue now, and every page I just have to send him an email. Go, oh my God, this is fantastic! You know, he just keeps topping himself. So good.
Right. Wonderful. It was really interesting when you're kind of talking about Ben's soul searching, because he does have a lot of the same qualities as Spider-Man, because there's Peter Parker rather, because he is obviously a clone. But I think really the biggest thing is Ben didn't feel the loss that Peter did with Uncle Ben. And I feel like that definitely contributed to their rift in their relationship, because they'll never really be best friends at all. But it's always like kind of like Peter feels like he has that one over him. I don't know if you want to speak on that a little bit.
Well, no, but I think Uncle Ben is still very much there in Ben's consciousness, but depending on where you pick up the story, when he thinks he's the clone, when you think that if you woke up tomorrow and someone told you all your memories were fake, first it would break your heart, but then you also have to kind of disassociate yourself from those memories, because you realize they're not yours. But all that guilt over Uncle Ben and all those things are still in there. But I also think, and we address this in the story, Ben in his 5 years on the road, he's grown in a different way than Peter has. So Peter is running on guilt all the time. Guilt is Peter's main motivator. Whereas Ben has learned not to wrestle with his guilt, to acknowledge it and move on, which is very, very different than having it weighing on your back like a mountain, you know? So it's an interesting thing, because all those memories are there, but he can't buy into them because he doesn't believe them. But at the place where our story takes place, this takes place back in that 90s era.
Right.
Peter and Mary Jane have gone off to have their baby and live happily ever after, which was the plan back then. You know, they were going to have their baby, and Peter could come back once in a while. They could have an adventure together. And Ben is just starting to build a life for himself. But even there, he can't be Peter. And he believes now that he's the real one, and Peter is the clone. So he can't be Peter, though, because everyone knows that Peter and just watched him go off to live happily ever after with Mary Jane. So he's starting from absolute nothing. No friends, no career, no life, really. He's living in a crummy apartment in the East Village in Manhattan. And he just got this really crummy job working in a coffee shop. This brilliant guy is working behind the counter in a coffee shop. And he's trying to discover if he can even have a life. Can he have friends? His mantra he keeps saying to people is, I don't do friends. I don't do friends, because he's lost everything. And part of his journey in the story is, can he learn to do that? Can he learn to open himself up and make human connections? The whole theme of the story, and I'm not going to get into the details, obviously, but it's about human connection, the lack of it and the need for it.
Right. And that's definitely a big like psychological question, right? I don't know if anyone here has taken a psychology class. I've taken a few, but a big human like fear is that feeling of aloneness. Because like a lot of times, right, when you get mad at the world, all you want to do is be alone, but really all you want is someone to listen to you.
Right.
But you feel like there's no one there, so it's like F them all, go away. Which I kind of feel like that's Ben's, that's my dog, if you heard a dog shake. So I feel like that's Ben's kind of situation, is he's like trying to figure out himself, but he's also at the same time mad at the world for his lack of acceptance. And it's really hard for him to really find those few people that can let him slip through the cracks.
Right, exactly, and that's what he's wrestling with in this series, and that's the journey that he goes on.
That's awesome.
And and that's what happened, during those lost years too, when he found Janine, and then he loses her, and then in this I did a mini series with Mike Zeck called Spider-Man Redemption, where he gets Janine back, but then she goes off to prison at the end. So he's, even when he finds it, he loses it. So you get really gun shy, and
Right.
As desperate as one may be for human contact, just what you said, there's a part of you that would rather push people away, because why bother? I'm just going to get hurt in the end.
Right. And that's kind of interesting. So why did you put Janine back in prison, or why did she go to prison?
Well,
If Ben was getting shot like so many times, like he was getting hurt left and right.
Well, Janine's backstory, the interesting thing about both Janine and Ben, these two people meet, they fall in love, and we discover that both of them are living lies. You know, Ben Reilly is not who he pretends to be. And Janine, it turns out, is not who she pretends to be. The backstory was that she had an abusive father who sexually abused her when she was young. And when she was a teenager, at one point, she couldn't take it anymore. She snapped and she killed her. And she's been on the run ever since. So these two people with these tragic backstories meet and fall in love. And what happened in the redemption storyline was that she comes to the point where she realizes she has to own up to what she did, and she has to turn herself in. She can't keep running. So at the end of that, she goes off to prison. At the same time that Ben basically convinces Cain of the same thing. Cain surrenders himself, Janine surrenders himself. And, you know, probably just at the point when Ben realizes that for all that went on between them, he and Cain really are brothers. And Cain is gone, and Janine is gone.
100%. I do want to get to the chat real quick because we have a lot of people hanging in here today. I do like to highlight some questions. This is actually one of my co-hosts, Stefan, says, who are some of your favorite characters during Just League International? Guy Gardner, and who else? He knows I'm not a Guy Gardner
fan. You know, Beetle and Booster were the heart and soul of that book. And it was always, always fun to write them. And you know, if there was one character that was closest to my heart, it was probably Beetle. You know, but the two of them were always great. And well, I loved all those characters, but Martian Manhunter also, because he evolved into the wonderful green straight man. You know, he was the one that had to put up with all their antics and always deal with it in a deadpan way. And there was a lot of humor to be had from him. But he's a character. He's one of my favorite DC characters. You know, it's a funny thing when you write these characters and when you read these characters. It's two different events. I read about Martian Manhunter for years, couldn't have cared less about the character. Didn't mean anything to me. Then you start to write the character and you start to get to know them again as if you're getting to know a real person. And then you fall in love with these characters. So that's what happened with the Martian Manhunter. You know, John Jones, he was just just another random DC character. And then I started to write him and it was like, oh, I love this character. So yeah, those are probably my three favorites, but I loved them all. Fire and Ice were great. Of course, Guy was great. The relationship between Guy and Ice was always great to write. There were so many wonderful relationships in that book because it was first and foremost, it was a relationship book. It wasn't a superhero book. It was a relationship book.
Right. And there's just so many different personalities in that book. I think probably like I think some of my favorite scenes from that book was whenever Black Canary would get mad at like Booster and Blue Beetle for like acting up, or like whenever she'd like just get mad at Guy. I just like loved her kind of being like the mother of the team.
Right.
But let's get back on track to Ben. So this is kind of running. It's similar to the Peter David stuff that he's been doing, writing symbiote Spider-Man back in the time of when Peter had the symbiote. This is obviously being back in the 90s when Ben Reilly kind of ventured off, got the suit. So this is following what was it? It was following the Clone Saga, the last issue there. Spectacular.
Yeah, this is we're really picking up right at the moment when Peter and Mary Jane have left and Ben is stepping back into that role full time.
Right. So what do you think would have happened if Brand New Day just what didn't happen, or Peter never lost his memories and Peter and Mary Jane got married? How would that affect Ben? And none of this would have ever happened, like continuity wise.
Well, clarify that. Wait, you're talking about years later when they did Brand New Day? That's
like years later, because if the plan was always that Peter and Mary Jane get married, right, and they have a kid, if that all didn't really get undone, how do you think
so back when we were doing it,
yeah.
Well, here's what the plan was. The plan was really, really simple. What we were going to do was get this story set and established, send Peter and Mary Jane off, and we were going to reboot all the books, all the Spider-Man books from #1, introduce new supporting cast, new villains. We really we were going to treat it as a new beginning for Spider-Man with, everything new and fresh. And so I think it would have been a great thing for Spider-Man. It would have been a great thing for Ben as a character. The problem that happened back then was that actually the Clone Saga had too much success. People seem to think it was a failure. It wasn't. It was it was right in the 90s when everything was tanking and the Spider-Man books were doing better than most. and they wanted marketing wanted the story to go on and on and on. And I left at a certain point for a variety of reasons. And that story went on for, I think, another year and a half after I left. Had we done it the original way, gotten in, told the story, established Ben as the true Spider-Man, sent Mary Jane and Peter off to have their happily ever after, I think there would probably still be Ben Reilly Spider-Man stories, from then to now. And then Peter was always there. You could have spun him off into his own book. He would have returned to the other Spider-Man books. They could have teamed up once a year. It would have been a big deal, So you would have had multiple characters there to exploit and play with.
Right, and that's really the interesting thing is when you have a character who's been around so many years, such as Peter Parker, debuting, I think it was 1963, 62, something like that.
62, I think,
62.
The first story came out, yeah.
And AF-15, right? There's just years and years of stories that you can obviously tell, but everything's you can kind of compare. Okay, this was done in this story. This was we've seen some similar tropes here. But bringing in a newer character such as Ben Reilly is so different. And I feel like when you do something different, which is what fans want 9 times out of 10, when they see it happening, they're like, no, I'm going back to the original.
Right. It's kind of what fans say they want 9 times out of 10. That's why it's great that, Miles Morales has been as successful a character as he is, because it could have been the same thing. What are you doing? We don't want that Spider-Man. We want this Spider-Man.
Right.
But like I said, had we been given the chance and done the story the way that we originally intended it, I think it would have played out very differently in the end. But look, here's the great thing. Now Ben is back, a very important part of the Marvel Universe. Because there was a period of time where, it seemed like everything to do with the Clone Saga was undone, swept under the rug, killed off, whatever. And eventually, over time, they all come back. And Ben and Kane especially are 2 great, great characters with so much depth to them that, they're really, to me, a very, very important part of the Spider-Man mythos and of the Marvel Universe.
Right. They're definitely becoming that. I would say that they're definitely important. And they're just they're another avenue for a story, because you can always tell a Spider-Man Green Goblin story, right? And you'll be able to sell it, be great, but we've seen it so many times. It's all about really expanding that universe. And I think Ben completely gives that direction that you want. And I'm really glad to see him even in today's. I think a lot of writers who kind of didn't like that era of comics or never really got to know Ben the same way as people who read the books and kind of got that information, kind of just bashed him aside, right? Kind of being a clone and everything. But it's really exciting to see him back. I've really been enjoying because this is one of my first introductions to Ben as Spider-Man, because obviously I wasn't born in the 90s, but I'm excited to kind of have that piece of history as well.
Right. But have you been able to go back and read the old stories and read things like Lost Years and Redemption and all that?
I did not read Redemption. I'm halfway through Lost Years. I think we're going to cover... I think I'm going to try to cover that on our archives segment that we do on the show. I'm thinking about working that in somewhere in our December schedule or November schedule, or not November, January schedule. But why do you think a lot of people cast Ben aside or not really want to get to know him as well?
It depends on who the people. How it works in cycles. So. The Clone Saga went on too long, and then the whole comic book industry tanked, and then they decided to bring Peter back and reboot the whole thing. And as I said, editorial kind of swept it aside, and so that put a taint on the whole thing. I think the way that story was dragged out, and then the way it was treated after that. But the people that were reading Spider-Man at the time, the vast, especially if you were a younger person, if you were 10, 12, 14,
right,
that was your Spider-Man. They're all adults now. And this is the way the cycle always works. And then they grow up and it's like, but that's my Spider-Man. I love Ben Reilly. So I think a lot of that, you can call it nostalgia or just, the things that we read at a certain age imprint on us in a way that they will never imprint on our brain ever again.
Right.
So there's a whole audience out there now that grew up with Ben and loves Ben and wants to read about Ben.
Right. And the really cool thing about Spider-Man, whether it's Miles Morales, I would even go as far to say Spider-Gwen, Peter, or Ben, is at the core, they really have the most human problems that we all do, and they juggle so much, right? A lot of times, right, like Peter, for example, has a full-time job. He has to take care of his aunt. His uncle died right in front of him. He has these powers he doesn't really know how to unlock or handle sometimes. And a lot of times our world or our day feels so jam-packed or like claustrophobic, and Peter is always sorting them out. And I think that's what makes Spider-Man so relatable, is no matter how hard his life gets, or any of the Spider-Man characters, is there's always a solution, and there's always a way around everything.
And you know, that's what was so revolutionary about the character back then when it first came out, because
Right.
there had never been a character like that,
Right.
you know. And the other great thing about Peter, and probably all of them too, but especially, Bruce Wayne puts on the mask and becomes Batman. Many of these guys kind of transform, but the book is always about Peter Parker, whether his mask is on or off. The story is about Peter. There's no difference really. You know what I mean? Um, and he's one of the single most human, relatable, psychologically real characters in the history of comics. And what I found over the years is that every writer that comes along, that I can't say every writer because I haven't spoken to every writer, all the writers that I know that have written Spider-Man identify with Peter. They see themselves in Peter. There's something about him that he becomes a mirror, because he really is the everyman of the Marvel Universe. And I think maybe what the character goes off the rails a little bit if he stops being that everyman. You know, he has to be that relatable kid from Queens on some level for him to really, really work.
Right. And as a kid, or like because I used to teach karate to a lot of kids. Probably I taught it for about 5-6 years right before the pandemic. But I worked in an area where there was a lot of minorities, right? A lot of Hispanic, African American children. For Halloween, I was really excited to see all of them when they told me, right? Because I asked them like probably like 2 weeks before, "What are you guys going to be for Halloween?" A lot of them said Spider-Man. I was expecting to see a lot of red, a lot of blue. I saw a lot of Miles Morales, which was
Yeah,
really
that's
exciting
great.
for me, because when I look at Spider-Man, and kind of what I never grew up with Spider-Man, like I saw him around here and there, but I didn't grow up with comics at a young age. I started getting into them more into my teenage life, early adulthood. But when I see Peter, because Peter was really a teenager, so I got to like see, okay, this is someone kind of around my age who's kind of doing the same thing that I'm doing. Just he's in New York and he can swing, and cool, fine. He has a girlfriend. I don't. We'll fix that later. But but he's a really
Yeah, but he
relatable
always had
person.
problems and he couldn't hold on to a
Right.
girlfriend, so it was okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's like he went through MJ, he went through Betty, he went through, and for some reason they all came back. So I'm like, okay, Peter, you did your job anyway. But I was really excited to see a lot of people wear Miles Morales. I'm sure a lot of people in the '90s wore a lot of Ben Reilly costumes.
Well,
And that
here's
just
the thing too. With Spider-Man, really, the reason why he's a white guy to begin with is because it was the '60s, and in
right,
media, unfortunately, everybody was a white guy. There is
right,
nothing about Peter and his life. You could tell those same exact stories. He could be a black kid. He could be a Latino kid. He could be anything,
right,
because it's that humanity is translatable
right,
across the
100%.
spectrum, the completely translatable. If Spider-Man was being created for the first time today, he would be Miles Morales, you know what I mean? Or he'd be Peter Parker, but that's what he would be,
Right,
because he would be reflecting the world in that way.
right, 100%. That is the best way to put it. And it's just great to see how Spider-Man can age throughout the decades, and the impact that him
Hmm.
as a character who's really, like we've been saying, is a human at heart. He's never changed who he is. When Batman, like you said, puts on the mask, he's his alter ego.
Yeah,
I would say when Daredevil, who's my personal favorite, puts on the mask, he's not Matt Murdock anymore. He's living 2 separate lives.
right.
Peter has always stayed to that same life and to those same core character traits
Yeah,
that have
yeah,
driven him forward throughout the years. Um,
absolutely.
what can we expect in this Ben Reilly series that has been different than any of your past work?
Wow, there's a lot of past work, so
There are,
you know,
I know. I'm like, when I
you
was
know,
like,
I don't know. I honestly, I don't know how to answer that question. I just know that when I write stories, I write from the characters out. I always say, I peel off the top of their heads. I get up my flashlight. I start poking around. I get out the drill. I want to explore every corner of their psyche. So it's always a psychological journey. It's an emotional journey for Ben, for the characters around him, for the antagonist, the main antagonist in the story, which I can't say who that is. Um, so and that's what I mean, that is what I always do. So I'm writing, and it's unique to the character in that moment in time. This is a Ben Reilly story, unlike, I guess, any other Ben Reilly stories, because it explores him at a time that hasn't been explored before. So I think there's a lot of big action going on, but all the action is a reflection of and serves Ben's inner journey through these 5 issues. Where he starts is not where he ends. He's a very different person by the end.
Right. And as a reader who, and let's say this is their first Ben Reilly story, how will they be able to pick up different character traits between Peter and Ben Reilly? How can they be able to distinguish, okay, this is Ben Reilly, this is Peter?
Because he's a different character. And if you if you're doing your job and you're writing it correctly.
I'm saying, like, what character traits draw them apart the most?
Well, I think we just discussed that, is that Ben has been through a lot of very different experiences than Peter has. He's a little darker, he's more cynical, he's a little more twisted, he's more isolated, he's a little angrier. And yet at his core is this good and decent guy trying to fight his way out, and trying to make human connection. As I said, the theme of this whole series is about either the need for or the rejection of human connection, and the price we pay for both.
Right, and that's really interesting, because I've read a lot of your books that you've done in Spider-Man. A lot of them end up being sad stories. Kraven's Last Hunt ended up being a very sad story with Kraven. Amazing Spider-Man 400, probably one of the most heartbreaking issues I've ever read, which is very important for a writer to have that stake. Because I've also seen you write a lot of funny moments in comics. I've seen you write a lot, which goes to show how diverse of a writer you are. How do you handle writing that heartbreak, not only knowing the fans' reaction, but your reaction to that if you were the reader?
You have to believe it 100%. You have to be those characters. You have to feel their struggles. You have to feel their pain and their joy. You have to feel it all. And talking about the Aunt May story, you know what happens in comics. People die, and inevitably someone does something, whether it's 6 months later or 60 years later, where their character comes back. When you're writing that story, you cannot be thinking about the fact that someday anyone is ever going to bring that character back. You have to treat that as 100% real. When Peter lost Aunt May, it had to be, in my mind, Peter losing Aunt May. So that I'm sitting there writing, I'm emotionally invested. Maybe I'm weeping along with Peter while I'm writing the story. I was weeping when I read it. One of the greatest things that ever happened in my career was, after that story came out, I came home one day and there was a message on my answering machine from John Romita Sr. to tell me how much he loved that story, and that it made him cry. And you can't ask for anything more than, because when I was growing up, Romita Sr.'s Spider-Man, that was my Spider-Man, So to have him leave that message and tell me how much that story meant to him was like, it was bliss.
That's like a dream come true,
Yes.
Right. That really goes to show, right? A lot of times, even on this show, I'll talk to some of my favorite creators, you being one of them. I've had the blessing of interviewing writers that I'm reading currently, writers that generations before have grown up with. So it's definitely been like a tremendous experience, especially when they give like a great compliment like that. It's really fulfilling. And that issue, Spider-Man 400, is definitely an issue that I will recommend to anybody, just because of how well done it is. And how heartbreaking it is. I loved it.
Thank you.
I really did, and it did make me cry. Even now, it's like I'm still feeling the same emotions. Right? You had Peter definitely right by the bedside, just sobbing. Mary Jane was there, and then what I found really interesting was Ben was on the outside of the window.
Right, and that's the whole Ben the Ben problem right there. He couldn't get in. He was like. I always think about Peter Pan outside the window, watching, Wendy and her brothers, and something he can never have, And Ben was kind of like that. He's on the roof. He's just above that room. He can hear what's going on, but he can't be there. 100%. And that, again, that's one of the struggles he's having in this series. Is like, all right, so now he's spent years thinking he's a clone. It's not real. All of a sudden, it turned around and they tell him, yes, it is real. These are your memories. But you still can't have that life. So he's still wrestling with, what do I do with these memories? What do I do with my connection to Aunt May and Uncle Ben? And how do I integrate that into my life now? Because I'm not, even though I am Peter Parker, I'm not Peter Parker, And he's in a very difficult space, and he's got to figure out how to honor that, but not be attached to it and create a life for himself. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Right. When I was actually reading that issue, and when I saw Ben, I definitely did get those Peter Pan vibes. But I think what really packed that punch was just seeing Ben on the outside.
Yes.
I'm sure we've all
Yeah.
been there, where we've seen people kind of gathering, and it not like by a deathbed, but we've seen people in a social setting, and all you want to do is just open the door and go in, right, head first, right? Obviously, that's easier said than done. That takes a lot of courage, right? But I found Ben's displacement in that situation, because obviously his memories are saying you're part of the family.
Yep.
But the family is saying something completely different.
Yep.
Or like the status quo of your life is saying, don't do it, which...
Right. If he walked into that room, what would happen? It would be chaos.
Right.
It'd be like throwing a stick of dynamite into that room. You know, he knew he
Right.
couldn't do it, as much as that's where he wanted to be more than any place on earth.
Right. And I think it would have definitely taken away from everything. What do you think would have happened if you wrote it differently?
If he would have walked in?
Yes. Yes.
Well, first of all, how could you do this to this dying woman? Suddenly there's another version of her nephew there. You know, that would be a terrible thing to do. You've just completely upended Peter's life. Not to mention, it wasn't Aunt Anna's there too. I mean, it would be complete chaos. And you would never have had also that same beautiful, heartbreaking moment.
Right.
It would have been all about Ben and not about Aunt May in that
100%.
moment. Yeah.
100%. Let's talk about Kraven's Last Hunt. Because that was my first Spider-Man story. I'll say that to anybody. That is probably, if I were to recommend any Spider-Man story, it's Kraven. Not everyone's favorite villain, not the villain that everyone points to the most when you hear the name Spider-Man, but he's definitely a very interesting one. Taylor, what was the big inspiration for this story?
You know, what you said about Kraven is exactly how I felt about him too. I didn't think he was much of anything. And the fun of it, and I've done this a lot of times with a lot of different characters, take that character that you think hasn't been exploited, that hasn't been explored, and see what you can do to make them. When that story started, I think if someone said, oh, they're going to kill off Kraven, people would go, yeah, who cares? The trick is to take them on a journey so that by the end, when that character does die, the reader's reaction is, no, you know, that they're so invested and they care so much. The short version is that story went through a lot of incarnations over the years. It started as an idea, believe it or not, for a Wonder Man miniseries. One of the editions of Kraven from a couple of years ago had a whole essay that I wrote where I get into all the details. And on my website, if you want to search my website, jmdmatteis.com, there's a post called The Story Behind the Hunt, which gets into all the details. But basically, I played with that idea for a few years. I pitched it a couple of times as a Batman story in different versions, obviously. But the core was always this idea of the villain burying the hero alive, the hero coming back, that journey. And then what happened was two things. I got a call where they asked me to reunite with Mike Zeck, who I'd been working with on Captain America before that. And originally, we were going to be the team on Spectacular Spider-Man. We were going to take over that book. And I thought, well, here's a chance to play with this story. And originally it had a completely different villain. I created a whole new villain who was going to go through this whole thing, bury Peter alive, take over as Spider-Man, the whole same journey, but with a new villain. And I always say, these are the days before the internet, so you had to do other things to waste time instead of working, you know?
Right.
So I was sitting in my office thumbing through a Marvel Universe handbook, and I came across the entry for Kraven. Again, this character that if I was going to make a list of my favorite Spider-Man villains,
he's not there.
He would not be on it. He would not be on it. And I still to this day don't know, was it ever in a story, or was the person that wrote this entry in the handbook, did they just make it up? But it said that Kraven was Russian. And, one of my favorite authors of all time is Dostoevsky. And I love the whole duality and angst of the Russian soul, and the way he writes about the struggles of the Russian soul. And I suddenly saw that Kraven was Russian, and something clicked in my mind, and I understood this character in a way I never had before. I called up my editor and I said, forget this new villain I've created. It's going to be Kraven. And that changed the whole story. And then because Mike Zeck and I had worked together on Captain America and created Vermin, I knew we needed a character to contrast Peter's vision of Spider-Man with Kraven's vision of Spider-Man. So we brought in Vermin. And then the story is one of those stories that really just kind of wrote itself. once the doors opened and I started to work, certain stories you're like, it's almost like you're chiseling every little bit and working on it. And other stories, it's like these doors open and you're unconscious and the waters just rush out. And with Craven, when I finally had a chance to tell that story, the doors opened and the waters just rushed out. And it's only later looking at that story that I could see what it was I was doing there.
Right. Right. And that was really interesting as well, just like seeing Craven's progression. Obviously Vermin, what happened is I read Vermin in that story and then I went back to Captain America because I was like, okay, this is what happened. And how did he get there? So I wasn't invested in Vermin, but I was really interested in his backstory as well because I don't know, he was really cool to me.
And if Marvel ever collects my Spectacular Spider-Man run with Sal Buscema, there's a lot more Vermin in that where you find out who he is. And Edward Whalen, who is the person that was transformed into Vermin to tie it all together, is part of this Ben Reilly series, a very important part of the Ben Reilly series.
I'm really invested in this Ben Reilly series now. That kind of leads me to this question that I really wanted to highlight. Just want to find a way to fit that in. After not reading comics for nearly 30 years, what helps me pick up a new issue of Spider-Man?
Well, you hope it's what makes you pick up any book, any comic book, or see any movie. You want to be told a good story. Isn't that what it all comes down to? It's all about tell me a story. It's the same thing that when we're 3 years old. Mommy, Daddy, tell me a story. Right. Enchant me. Take me to another place. Take me inside the hearts and minds and souls of other people. Let me see the world. So, you want a great story, and it's always my story first. You know what I mean? It's always about the story. It's not about me. It's about the story and where the story and the characters lead me. And I have faith that what we're telling here is a really good story. And you don't need to know all the backstory to pick this up. Right. I don't like comics where you have to know all this stuff just to understand what's happening in a story. We get that information across to the reader. We set it up and we move on.
Right. And Marvel does this really cool thing in the beginning. I wish DC did, is they kind of give a little backstory. Like whenever you pick up a Spider-Man issue, like has a little blurb of what's going on. Or if you pick up an issue of Daredevil or an issue of, even if Squirrel Girl had an issue out, I don't read Squirrel Girl, I'm just throwing it out there. But Marvel always kind of puts a little blurb on the front page of kind of like you would see on the back of a book, letting you know the synopsis.
Right. But also, if the writer is doing their job right, they should be able to communicate that information within the story without clubbing you over the head with it, without dragging the story and saying, blah, 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 a lot of exposition. You get it. Like in Ben's case, you need to know the backstory to understand his psychology. It's all through the framework of his psychology. So you get that information and you move on.
Right. And creators know a lot of times there are a lot of books on the shelves, right? Even they haven't read everything. So they're not going to expect you to. So they're always like trying to tell a tale that's new, refreshing, but also giving respect to the history for those who have been.
Right. And it's a fine balance. It's a fine balance.
Or at least the hope is that there is that fine balance.
Right. And sometimes there's not. And sometimes you feel like you need to have a little book of continuity with you in order to enjoy. Happens with the movies too. I think sometimes the movies are so into having all the little connectors from all the different movies showing up. And if you're just walking in to see a movie, there's going to be 20 things in that movie that you may not know what in the world they're talking about. And it can get in the way of enjoying the story. The way to do it right, which they do more often than not, is to have it in there in a way that you don't need to know it, but the fans that do know it can appreciate it.
Right. And the ongoing, I don't know if you're reading the ongoing, or you probably have read the ongoing Ben Reilly stint that they're going on right now. Have you?
I have not. They keep me aware of what's going on, but I haven't actually read it.
What's really cool about that is we just came off of Spider-Man, like, what was it? It was probably 80 some issues total with all the tie-ins and everything. That was so instilled in Spider-Man History and Brand New Day and Spectacular Spider-Man from the 80s. Nick Spencer really loved that run. And everything that David Michelinie did, because there were a lot of moments from those eras that a lot of newer readers.
Right, I know in the Nick Spencer stuff, they were actually reprinting pages from stories that I wrote.
Right.
In the new Nick Spencer stories, yeah.
Right, so he obviously fell in love with that era Marvel and put that in his story, and it was very forefronting to the point where if you didn't know Spider-Man's history, it wasn't as attractive to get into. What's really refreshing about this Ben Reilly Spider-Man they're going on right now is it's not so instilled in the history of Ben Reilly. It's more like he's back, he's part of this corporation, and he's Spider-Man. We're going forward. We're not
and just go from there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know he's a clone. You know him and Peter have this rift. Peter's not around to have that rift because he's unfortunately in a coma, but you're continuing with Ben Reilly and you're getting to know him, which is really exciting that we're not. It's cool to retcon stuff, but it's not like the story's based off of this story that happened 30 years ago.
Right. Which is great. Which
Right.
will help move the character forward. Yeah.
Right. Which I really am excited, which that's why I'm loving it the most, because Ben Reilly, this is my first ongoing Ben Reilly series for me. So that's really refreshing that I don't have to go back. Because with Nick Spencer's a lot of time, I was like, oh, I know this panel. And I would go back. I'm like, oh, it's right here. It's in this book. Or a lot of the Jonah Jameson and the Robertson moments from Spectacular with Tombstone. That was a big moment. And I was like, I like picked up on that. So I can definitely understand why a lot of people were not attracted to it, but Spider-Man's at an all-time high, I would say, which is really exciting for newer readers.
That's great.
Other than that, is there anything we need to know about Spider-Man, or anything do you want to talk about with this book coming out in January?
No, I think we've said a lot, and I don't want to give away plot details.
Right.
So we talked about the themes, we talked about Ben and where he's at and what his journey is going to be. A little hint about some of the characters like Edward Whalen, who was Vermin, and Dr. Kafka comes back. So Ravencroft is a big part of this story. And we'll see a lot of old Spider-Man villains, as well as, I don't want to get into it, but the main antagonist will be someone surprising. That's all I'll say.
Right. And I'm really excited. If you guys really liked this interview, definitely talk to your shops today. So make sure they can reserve a copy for you. This issue comes out in January. I believe it's the first week in January, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I never know.
I don't know. When it comes out,
I'm the last one to know. I have to look online myself to find out when things are coming out.
I'm like, I don't want to. It's out in January. That's all.
Yeah, that much I know. And from what I've heard from my editor, the orders have been very good. So our hope is that if this does well, we'll follow it up with another one. Yeah.
Right. Kind of what they're doing, Peter David, just to show off some of these images one more time. For everybody who's new to the chat and didn't catch these earlier, this is David Baldion's amazing artwork that I just really want to hold in my hand when this comes out. I don't think I can wait a month, but definitely make sure you guys contact your LCS. DeMatteis is one of my favorite writers. Obviously, a lot of people who's read his work is also excited for this. So that's a strength to his. But I'm really excited. So make sure you guys contact your shop. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. We're pushing towards that 500 limit. Haven't really been announcing, but we do have something special in gear for that. Other news on the channel. Yesterday we dropped our review of Batman Joker War. That's out now. That got a lot of good reception. So definitely go check that out. And then Monday is weekly wrap up. That's our weekly comic book review show. And this was a really heavy week. DC obviously dropping all their annuals on us. I wish comics were back then, because all their issues now are $6, especially for their annuals. So if you drop like 10 annuals, that's $60 for DC Comics. I'm like, I wish that we went back to the, $1.99, 35-cent pages.
$6.
Wow.
$6. That's a lot of money.
$6. And then they released this whole Gotham villain thing that Danny DeVito was writing, or he did a Penguin story that I heard was really good, and that was $10. I was like, wow. Danny DeVito's writing it, so I gotta get it.
While we're talking about DC, before we go, I'll throw in a plug for Justice League Infinity, which is what I'm currently writing for DC. If you're a fan of the Justice League Unlimited television series, which I wrote for, James Tucker, who was one of the producers on that show, he and I are doing Justice League Infinity, which is essentially the next season of Justice League Unlimited, and we're having a blast with that. Issue number 6 comes out next week. Yeah.
Right. I will say I have not been reading because I have not watched Justice League Unlimited yet. It's been on my.
Do you have HBO Max? They're all on HBO Max.
I do. I'm probably gonna watch them today. But
yeah, it's actually, forgetting my own involvement with the TV series, but it's one of the best versions of the Justice League ever done. Bruce Timm and all that whole team, phenomenal work. Really definitive versions of those characters. So to revisit that universe right now has just been a pleasure. Really a pleasure.
Right. I guess for me, why I never got into it was I'm the only one in my family that's like into all like the different fandoms. We kind of bond together with Harry Potter, but that's about it. I had such a relationship with Star Wars at a young age because of my uncle. I thought if I did anything else, I was cheating on like Natalie Portman. So that was like my little kid mindset. When my like second grade teacher said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I always said a Jedi.
Oh, that's funny. Well, when you have a chance, just watch there's I think two or three seasons of Justice League, then 3 seasons of Justice League Unlimited. And see, Unlimited is amazing. It is. It's a great show, and I'm very proud of the work I did on the show, and very proud of this new book that we're doing.
Before we do leave, we always ask all of our creators, because we're all X-Men fans here, who is your favorite X-Men character?
That's a good question. My favorite X-Men character. You know, when I was first reading Marvel, like in junior high school, that was the original X-Men, the original configuration of the X-Men. So those are the ones that are always nearest and dearest to my heart. And then when I was writing the Defenders at Marvel, I brought in the Beast and Iceman and Angel and brought them all into the Defenders. So, and I think out of all of those, probably the Beast. Because, you know, I don't know what the Beast is like today, but that incarnation of the Beast could have fit in very easily with Justice League International.
Right.
You know, he had the right tone, the right attitude, the right sense of humor, and yet he was this really brilliant guy at the same time, who was almost masking his intelligence with his humor. So I always enjoyed writing the Beast. So I'll say the Beast.
Yeah. I'm glad, because anyone but Cyclops would have been a good answer. Yeah, see, everyone's just saying how much I love Cyclops. Yeah, it's not true. Anyway, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. Stay tuned for more announcements. On Wednesday, we were sitting down with John Leese, part of AWA Upshot, talking about Hotel, which is his horror anthology series, which I'm really excited to talk to him about and promote that as well. Always love promoting indie work. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. We have weekly wrap-up on Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Have a great rest of your weekend.
You know, let's go, baby.